It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Fiona Frank, who's organising these events, and our speaker today, Ali Rocha from Brazil Matters, to tell us more about the political context of what's happening in Brazil.
So I just wanted to introduce Ali and Rebecca before we began. I just wanted to introduce Ali and Rebecca and say how pleased we are to have them here. And to thank Janet and Dave for hosting us. So this is a programme, a month's lot of events that we're doing for Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, and honouring them and other people who have lost their lives defending the rainforest. And we're doing this from Halton Mill in Lancaster because Sian Phillips, Dom's sister, is a Lancaster musician with lots of links to Halton Mill, and we've decided to do a lot of things around here. So we're doing an exhibition and some concerts and some exhibition and some art things and photography, and a conference in a week's time, which I'm going to send you all details of. Last week we had a beautiful talk by Dr. Nelly Marubo, an Indigenous leader from the Javari Valley who had worked with Bruno Pereira, and she recommended, among others, this amazing book, which I bought last week, and which is an evening's read and is completely mind-blowing, and I recommend it to everybody.
Oh, what's it called?
It's Ideas to Postpone the End of the World by Ailton Krenak. I sent it around last week as the book recommendation, but I will send it around again to the people that have been here this week. So this week, we are very pleased to have a very timely talk from Ali Rocha from Brazil Matters and Rebecca Lera from oh, sorry, I've been spelling your name wrong the whole week. Rebecca Lera from Smoke Signal. And Ali, Brazil Matters is really on top of what's happening in Brazil. It's a London-based political activist organisation. And I met Ali in London when I went to see Dr. Nelly Marubo speaking live. She was at that event, and I was really pleased to get to know her and find out more about Brazil Matters and about the film club that she's involved with in London as well, which is going to be hosting a film early next year. So I'm really pleased that we're going to be, it's just such an amazing time. We launched our series of events on the 30th of October. Janet was there. There were 120 people there. We had national coverage in The Guardian. It was such an exciting day. One of our musicians had just come back from London from voting, and so it's so incredible to think that there might be some change. We didn't know when we booked Ali to speak what she was going to be able to tell us about. We thought it might be just some terrible business as usual, and it's just so fantastic to have you both here to tell us about something that might finally be changing. So hand over to you two, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for inviting me. But I also wanted to remind you that you forgot our third guest, a very special guest that I invited to be with us in the last moment, which is Jan Rocha, my mother, who was the BBC and Guardian correspondent for many years in Brazil, and who has been following the political situation and the action of different governments in the Amazon in these years. So I'll get back to them a bit later. I'm just gonna start, it's great to have this opportunity to share with everyone a bit of the hope and the excitement that we're feeling with all the election results. But first of all, I just wanted to say a bit about Brazil Matters, what we do. We're an activist collective, and we work to denounce human rights violations in Brazil and support grassroots movements and activists on the ground and the front line of resistance there. So we do a lot of work with, environmentalists, with indigenous people there, supporting, the different causes that they're fighting. Different. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
So we try and give visibility to Brazilian issues in the UK because there's not so much news coverage or attention to what happens in Brazil. So we also try to point the role of the UK programs we have in Brazil. So we do this by organizing protest screenings, debates, actions, and we also connect with local groups in the UK who are fighting similar causes. We know that all the things are connected globally more and more. So, you know, we've organized with London Mining Network, Greenpeace, Survival International, some other smaller grassroots organizations. We've denounced British mining. How, you know, there's many ways in which the UK plays a role in what's happening in the Amazon, in the destruction of the Amazon. For example, mining companies, British mining companies, Anglo-American, had several requests to mine in indigenous lands. So through protests, they've kind of removed some of these requests we've heard. So they had requested to mine in indigenous Munduruku indigenous land, which is one of the peoples who has been suffering enormously with illegal logging during Bolsonaro's government. We also have done many protests aligned with Brazil's indigenous movement, which has grown strong, very strong in the last decade or so. And they, you know, they every year they have free land camp, which they call free land camp, when they indigenous peoples, you know, thousands of indigenous peoples from different groups and parts of Brazil travel to the Brazilian capital to make different demands, to demand their rights. The last one, it always happens in April. And the last one in April, we also did a protest here to call attention to what they were calling for in Brazil. And this year, they always have different themes. And this year, the theme was reclaiming territories, reclaiming Brazil, demarcating territories, and indigenizing politics. And since then, this year, we had a record number of indigenous people running for offices in Brazil. And we had the biggest number of indigenous people elected to Congress. So we've had 4 indigenous people elected to Congress. 2 of them are indigenous women, 2 indigenous leaders who are, you know, very prominent leaders in the indigenous movement in Brazil, Sonia Guajajara and Célia Chacriabá. So we've also did, following the disappearance of Dom Phillips Bruno Pereira, we did a video outside the embassy and, you know, got to the ambassador to talk to Sean, to Dom's relatives. We got, you know, through this protest, you know, we got the ambassador, them to see the ambassador and to demand that more be done to try and find them. Dom was a personal friend of mine. At that time, we didn't know what their fate was, but we already had strong suspicion that the outcome would be the tragic outcome that we've had. So I just, you know, wanted to say thank you very much to Rebecca Leder, who's here. Rebecca Leder is the articulator, the coordinator of Smoke Signal, which is a social environmental monitor, like a timeline to accompany the crisis in the environment under Bolsonaro's government. Rebecca is on holidays. After 4 years, she finally managed to get some holidays. So I wanted to say a special thanks for her for joining us today. But the last 4 years have not been easy for any of us who activists who work on, the different causes that Bolsonaro has, been, giving us nightmares every day. The last 2 months were especially stressful and tense, as we didn't know what was going to happen in the elections. There was real danger that Bolsonaro might be re-elected because of the use of the state machine, manipulation, fake news, misinformation, vote buying schemes. The amount of electoral crimes that he committed during his campaign are just unprecedented. No doubt this was the dirtiest electoral campaign in Brazilian history. I couldn't sleep for many nights. We were campaigning, until the very last moment to try and get as many people as possible to vote for Lula. And then finally, late at night on October 30, we finally sighed in relief. We could see light again after years of darkness. We could dream, we can smile again. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Lula, from the Workers' Party, defeated the genocidal climate change denier Jair Bolsonaro by just 1.8% of the votes. It was the most polarized presidential election ever. But his victory was massive and it was historical, because it was only possible because of the progressive forces, the blacks, indigenous, quilombola, the women, the LGBT plus, the workers, who all came together to campaign and to cast their votes on Lula. We knew that the Amazon would not survive another Bolsonaro term, and we defeated Bolsonaro. Brazilian people in all their diversity were responsible for this victory, and I cannot describe how good it feels. It's so powerful, it's so strong, it's very emotional. Lula's victory is not a victory only for Brazil and for Brazilians. There's a victory for the Amazon, for Latin America, for humanity, and for life itself. It was certainly the most important election of our lives. Many indigenous communities and other groups in remote areas of the Amazon and in rural areas didn't have access to transport to go and cast their votes, because local governments who were supposed to provide transport for them as determined by the electoral court, many of them being Bolsonaro supporters, did not provide them with transport, so they couldn't get to the polling stations. And people, they knew of the importance of getting to the polls, so they find all sorts of ways. That some people who walked like 25 kilometers to get to the polls. Then when the poor indigenous peoples, they got two buses on credit to make sure that everyone managed to get to the polls and cast their vote on Lula. They knew that each vote counted. Every vote was needed to defeat Bolsonaro and his government of death. Indigenous people knew better than anyone else how important it was to defeat Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, as everyone knows, is an enemy of the environment and of forest peoples. Under his government, there's been a record increase in deforestation. There's been advanced logging, cattle grazing, soy plantation, fishing, mining, especially in preservation areas. There's been a dismantlement of government protection agencies and a huge increase in the murder of indigenous people and Amazon defenders. Now we have hope for the Amazon, for the planet, for our future. We are very optimistic because of Lula's legacy in previous mandates, and because he promised to make the defense of the environment a priority of his administration. Lula's previous mandates between 2003 and 2010, 2 mandates, he implemented important environmental policies such as the expansion of protected areas and indigenous territories, and use remote sensing for real-time monitoring of the Amazon. There was also a strategic focus on monitoring and enforcement in areas with high deforestation rates, re-establishing and regulating system of environmental sanctions, and making compliance a condition for financial aid. Annual deforestation in the Amazon under Lula's government was reduced by 80%. So the 8 years of Lula's government and then 2 years of Dilma, of his successor governments, the total drop in deforestation rates was 82% in 10 years. So that's massive. And Lula has now pledged to drop the illegal deforestation in the Amazon to zero. He's made very important promises during his campaign. One of them was to create the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples. And he will definitely make environmental agenda a priority. So we know that Lula is also going to have many challenges during his government, because we also elected for Congress the most conservative Congress since the redemocratization. We know that most of these people conservatives belong to the agriculture and farming lobby, which is anti-indigenous and anti-environment. And we also elected 6 of the Amazonian states re-elected Bolsonaro allies of Bolsonaro, who again are anti-indigenous and anti-environment. So these are 2, challenges. These are the forces that Lula is going to have to deal and negotiate with. But a lot of these politicians, they swing, so they call the center, the centrão, or politicians that have right, center right, but they will, align with whoever is in power, whoever can give them financial support. And on top of that, another big challenge you're going to have is all these people, all these criminals who have been empowered by Bolsonaro, who are acting in the Amazon. A lot of these are still refusing to accept Lula's victory. They're still protesting, they're holding protests up and down the country, but in the Amazon especially, there's been these protests of closing the roads, and even a couple of days ago there were attacks on the highway police who were trying to unblock the roads. They actually fired guns at the police. So to actually make these people that know, the law and legislation again that they're going to have to respect might be the challenge. Yesterday, it was announced that one of Lula's promises, which was the creation of indigenous, the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, has gone through, because Lula has already started working. They've already got a transition team, and there has been announced that there's already a group set up to implement this new ministry for indigenous peoples. I'm receiving some information now about some of the demands of the indigenous peoples for Lula's government, which I want to go back to a little bit later. I think I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca, so she can tell us a bit about all this hard work in the last 4 years, and what maybe she can start telling us what prompted her to think and to create this social environmental monitor during Bolsonaro's government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay,
Yep.
so thanks for the invitation to be here today. And as Ali mentioned, I'm in the middle of my holidays. I'm in Germany and my connection is not so good. And haven't been working now for 10 days. So sorry if I'm a bit slow sometimes, but I'll try to follow up on this great introduction and overview that Ali brought us. So I'm Rebecca, I'm 45 years old. I'm a journalist and I've been working as a human rights and social environmental activist since 1996 in Brazil. So I worked for the Atlantic Rainforest Foundation, then I worked for Greenpeace for 11 years. Then I worked for Amnesty International, also for the the Global Commission on Drug Policy. So I've been trying to address drug policy reform and land use, climate change, forest issues all my career, over 25 years, working on those issues, because I look at, these are like kind of the main unresolved legacies for Brazil from, since colonial times and through the whole dictatorship and other stages that we had in our history. So you can see clearly the inequalities and the lack of rights and the lack of access to land and to housing and to basic human rights. It's connected to land use policies and also to drug prohibition in Brazil in a very specific way. So having been dedicating my life to covering those issues and to helping with strategic communications for these causes for different NGOs and collectivists, and working independently as a consultant since 2016. When Bolsonaro got elected in 2018, I can say that Brazilian civil society, as most of Brazilian society in general, was not ready. I mean, we were in a certain way taken by surprise, in a sense that, it happened very fast. I mean, he became a viable candidate and got elected in less than a year. And, in terms of like politics and everything you need to do to set up campaigns and to raise the money and to get organized, it's a very short time. And that happened among a very, now we know, like a very dirty judicial campaign against Lula. He got arrested in the middle of the election. So in 2018, we were kind of like taken aback, and we had to deal with a reality as activists that was from day one of his election. He was very outspoken about how we were considered enemies of the countries. He labeled us as terrorists, as criminals. Many of us, including myself, had our private data, such as addresses and social security numbers, leaked among, their social media environment. So that was very scary, to have my private data spread out among them. And from the beginning, as an independent activist, I was thinking, what we can do, like what's our role now in a situation where there was like a high risk of working on the field, as what happened to not only Dom and Bruno, but so many other people showed, and also due to resources and structures and how the state was reacting, the state institutions, like beyond government. So looking at this big picture, I realized in 2019, early 2019, that, there was a very mean or like malignous, I don't know if it can word, sorry if I'm inventing English words, but like very evil kind of tactic behind his way of governing. So it's shock doctrine, where like you have all this fake news, disinformation, and attacks and hate speeches happening on a daily basis, either by himself or some high-ranking government official, and that gets replicated in the different levels of society, but also a lot of like proactive work to change laws and to reform civil institutions that, for instance, did all the environmental control in the country, or did all the assistance to indigenous peoples, or looked over land use and regulation in the country. Because in Brazil, especially in the northern part of the country, in the Amazon region specifically, you have millions and millions of hectares of lands that either are public lands or non-designated lands. They are not protected, and they're not used by any specific entity. So they belong to the federal government. They're under the responsibility of the federal government, and they are located in the most remote areas of the Amazon. So where there are no roads and it's very expensive to get to. But those lands, it's where the valuable timber is, and it's where you can grab the land, or you can invade and occupy the land illegally, because there is no control as well. So what we saw over these 4 years in terms of land grabbing, land invasion, and the illegal occupation of public lands in Brazil was unprecedented. I think only when the Portuguese arrived here in like 500 years ago, this happened at a similar scale, because it was really like, that was the basis for the whole environmental crime explosion that we saw. You know, it always starts with land grabbing. So it's land grabbing that pushes the agribusiness frontier further into the forest. And we saw that it's visible on the map how in 4 years it did like this, the angle of the agriculture frontier, the line you see on the map, it just moved further into the most remote and preserved areas of the forest. And I don't think it's random that, Vale do Javari became world known because of violence. And when I lived in the Amazon between 1998 and 2001, and it was already dangerous, like my Greenpeace colleague then was under threat, and we had to hang out with bodyguards. But there was like a notion, like a line that you didn't cross. And, you didn't cross the line against public servants like Bruno Pereira, and you didn't cross the line against international journalists or activists. So the fact that he belonged to Greenpeace back then sort of protected him. And during this past 4 years, this kind of invisible line that even the criminals in the Amazon didn't cross, it was just suspended. Any social contract of sharing that space was on hold, because Bolsonaro government backed the most horrible and violent occupation of Amazon lands in the last 100 years at least. And that reflects on deforestation rates, and that reflects on the number of hotspots and fires we witnessed, not only in the Amazon, but also in the savannas and the Pantanal, the wetlands, which was the greatest fire of all times in 2020, with like almost 80% of the biome under fire at a certain point. And it's a wildlife reserve. So also like the whole biodiversity crisis beyond, the indigenous peoples and the Afro communities, the Quilombola communities, but also like the biodiversity laws we had over these 4 years. It's unsurmountable. We can't even count for that. As well, the rise on greenhouse gas emissions that is linked to land use in Brazil, placing us among the top 5 emitters in the world. So it's all very kind of I'm still grieving, you know, like I'm happy and relieved for Lula's election, of course, but I'm still grieving and I'm still very angry and upset. And I'm looking forward that, you know, the work that we do with smoke signals. Sorry, I got a little bit lost there. And I started talking about myself and then the Amazon, but then, yeah, just going back to why we do what we do, and this monitoring that we started in 2018 when we realized that it was kind of planned, this attack on the environmental institutions, the NGOs, the activists, the indigenous groups, and you know, it was all a plan to make land more accessible to land grabbers and to cattle ranchers and to loggers. And in practice, it secured land and for a new cycle of commodities expansion in Brazil, in my analysis, you know, like they have land to expand cattle production and also soy production for another 10 years now. So much was deforested and devastated that it secured this new cycle of economic development in this current model, also for mining industry in the Amazon. So we realized that it was a very like organized and systematic attack, and it was going to last the whole government, and it was actually a central economic agenda for Bolsonaro, because many people said he was incompetent, but I think it takes a lot of a certain kind of intelligence and effort to accomplish the level of destruction he did, you know, in a very sad way. And many people helped him to do that. So including state governors, senators, federal deputies, the whole like Congress machine, but also scientists and journalists and influencers. And, you know, there's a whole chain of people that got involved in this project. And I'm hoping that the work that we did with the monitoring and the organizing all these events in a timeline that is accessible and that references the primary source of the information. So it's a tool, like it's a public service that we wanted to offer to help fight disinformation on this issue, and also specifically to bear witness and to build a memory, because without memory, there is no justice nor reparation. So we want to see this memory used to further hold these people accountable for the crimes against humanity they committed during the past 4 years, so that it doesn't happen again. Because, you know, as Ali said, it was all very close. And I'm afraid to say that if we had another 2 weeks of campaign, maybe he would have won, you know, because the amount of money and the amount of lies that were being told, the manipulation that was going on, we almost lost this election. And that's very scary. And how we come back from that, not only in terms of like helping Lula rebuild the country and the institutions that were destroyed by Bolsonaro, but also how we hold these people accountable and how we create like this commission of truth about the Bolsonaro years, and how do we embarrass and how do we name and shame them at international fora so that they're not welcome and they're not relevant politically. Because also, just to finalize, I speak a lot, so please cut me off, but just to wrap it up, I think what happened in Brazil, it's not detached from what happened in the UK and what happened in the US and what happened with the extreme far right as a whole around the world in the last years. And I think it's connected to our efforts for climate justice that, you know, go to the core of this new colonialist and hyper-capitalist system that we see defended by this extreme far right. So I think everything is connected, and Brazil is kind of a central it's a key frontier in this extreme far right plans for the world. So Bolsonaro sure received a lot of funds from international donors. And that's why I think the international community has a role to play on, holding them accountable, but also supporting Brazil to rebuild after this nightmare that we are starting to come out of. I'm a little bit more cynical than Ali. I think Lula, he improved a lot in his discourses and messaging around environmental issues. I think he evolved, and that's great, but I was very critical of his first governments in this agenda specifically, despite the drop in deforestation. There were many other problematic stuff, including with oil and gas in Brazil. So it's not only the Amazon here, we also have an energy matrix and nukes and everything. So I don't want to polemize, but I'm just saying it's complex, and I'm going to remain a critical, but the one that wants to solve the problems. So thank you very much again. I hope it was clear enough, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I thought you might want to also talk a bit about the report that you launched in August, because it's a valuable resource for journalists.
Sorry.
And then maybe you can tell people how they can access the report.
Okay.
Tell us a bit about that, please.
Sorry. So for this year, like as a result of this monitoring that we did since 2019, we produced a guide, and it's called The Amazon and the Future of Brazil, an analysis of the 9 states of the region between 2018 and 2022. And so what we did was to collect testimonies from local land defenders and activists and indigenous experts and teachers and students and young people. So we heard a variety of local people that are actually worried about the situation there and are fighting on the front lines to defend human rights and the land and the forests in the Amazon. And based on those testimonies I did some research with the best available data from universities and civil society institutions, and also official organizations and NASA. And for each of the 9 states, we look at deforestation and land use, indigenous emergency, disinformation and fake news, how that played a role at the local level, how the state government looked like, the state assemblies, and also the representation of each state at the National Congress in Brasilia. So the Amazon Caucus, how they behaved towards key legislation that Bolsonaro tried to advance in Congress, and also how they behaved in terms of like the overall budget of the government. And yeah, we just tried to give like an in-depth look into each of the 9 states. And now we are preparing like an updated insert post-election to show how, the Amazon Caucus is going to look at the next Congress. And it's not good. It actually got a lot worse. As it's just dominated basically by the farmers, the big landowners actually, and cattle ranchers, and the most retrograde sectors of the Brazilian economy, and they're very much relying upon this very aggressive use of land and land grabbing. And also the governors, as Ali said, out of the 9 states, 7 have a Bolsonaro allies as state governments, and that's going to prove to be a real challenge for Lula in terms of distributing funds from the Amazon Fund and making sure that the environmental agencies are allowed to work. Yeah, and just to finalize, I think we also covered violence, and each state has a massacre or a very violent killing related to human rights defenders in the region. And, you know, some stories get more attention than others, but all of them communicate that it was really a project and not an isolated case. You know, what happened to Bruno and what happened to Dom and what happened to many other indigenous leaders and activists in Brazil over the past 4 years. Yeah, so I'm gonna put on the chat the links to the Twitter and to our website. We have a Twitter in English as well that we try to curate the best coverage about Brazil and also from Brazil in English. So to network with you guys, so you're most welcome to follow us and join us and share your concerns with us as well. We aim to keep the monitoring at least for the next 100 days of the new government. And then we are evaluating how to use this memory in, you know, at the International Criminal Court or whatever international effort happens to make them accountable. So you can count on us on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for all this amazing work that you do and that you've done, especially in the last 4 years. I'm gonna now pass over to Jan Rocha. Jan, like I said previously, is a journalist. She's written some books. She's been BBC correspondent during the dictatorship, and then on for a few more years, and then became also the Guardian correspondent. She's written books about massacre in the Yanomami indigenous land, massacre by illegal miners. We know under Bolsonaro, there was an invasion of 20,000 illegal miners, and the level of destruction and violence against the community are shocking. So Jan has followed, you know, throughout the decades and different governments, you know, how this has happened. So maybe, Jan, you can tell us a little bit about how, you know, the different governments acted within the Amazon throughout these years and what we can expect now from Lula's presidency, Lula's administration. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion with some very interesting people. Well, I first went to the Amazon a long, long time ago, actually in the 60s, when I was a young volunteer in Brazil. And in those days, it's worth remembering, there weren't any roads at all. The roads, in fact, were the rivers. So you travel by boat, or you travel by flying plane or hydroplane, because most of the towns and cities also didn't have landing strips, didn't have airfields.
Could you,
So
excuse me,
was,
could you just tip your camera down so that everyone can see your mouth, please?
Sorry, like that?
Thanks. Lovely, thanks.
Is that right?
Just tip it down a bit further so we can see your chin. It's better for people who are lip reading.
I want to hide my chin. Is that better?
Yeah,
Janet?
thanks. Just keep your head up.
Okay. Okay, so in those days, there weren't any roads really in the Amazon. The rivers were the roads really. You travel by boat, by canoe, whatever was available, or there were flying boats, hydroplanes, which landed on the water, of course. So the forest was almost entirely intact. The forest was an incredibly beautiful thing to travel through. This vast, very noisy place, actually, because the forest is always full of birds and animals and so on. And that was in the 60s. Then the military, who came to power in 64, began to build roads. They wanted to conquer the Amazon. They wanted to integrate it into the rest of Brazil. So they set about a very ambitious road building program. The main road was what was called the Trans-Amazonica, which ran from east to west, across the middle of the Amazon. They also started building a road called the Perimetral Norte, which ran through the territory of the Yanomami Indians. These roads, of course, brought with them, because they went through indigenous lands, they brought with them disease, they caused lots of deaths among the indigenous peoples. But the idea of the military was to use the roads to bring people from other parts of Brazil. And one of the dictators actually said, we're going to bring people who have no land from the northeast to a land which has no people, i.e. the Amazon, as though the Amazon wasn't inhabited, as though there weren't already, and had been, of course, for thousands of years, huge indigenous populations. I mean, they were huge when Brazil was discovered, but they were largely decimated by disease again. But there were hundreds and hundreds of different Indian ethnic groups living in the Amazon. So to say it was a land without people was to completely ignore the existence of all the people who did live there. And apart from the indigenous people, there are all the what used to be called caboclos, who were people who were descendants of Indians and white peoples and settlers and colonists who'd married, who'd produced offspring. So there was quite a large population living along the river banks too. But the idea was always to bring everything under control. So people were bussed up also from the south of Brazil, from places like Rio Grande do Sul, where there was very little land left, and there was no intention of dividing up the big estates. There was no intention of having a land reform. So the solution was to take people thousands of miles away up to the Amazon and dump them in the forest with a bit of land there. And this is the origin of many of the people who live in Amazon today. They are the descendants of people who were bussed up there or brought over from the northeast to people the Amazon. And in fact, this wasn't the first time this sort of thing had happened, because during the Second World War, Brazil was seen by the Americans as an important source of rubber, because the plantations in the east, in Malaya and so on, had been lost to the Japanese. So there was a desperate need for rubber for all the vehicles. So the Americans and the Brazilian government of the time, which was Getúlio Vargas was the president, they concocted a scheme to bring over from the northeast thousands and thousands of men to work in the rubber. They weren't plantations in Brazil. The rubber was just naturally there, and they were actually called colocações. So each rubber tapper was responsible for a certain number of trees. This again was a disastrous plan, because so many people, so many men just died, or were attacked by wild animals, died of hunger very often because they're abandoned in the forest. The rubber was supposed to be collected by boats. They didn't always arrive. So again, it was a time of when imposing a solution on the Amazon, which left behind many victims. When actually I went to the state of Acre, which is a state in the far west of the Amazon, in the late 1980s, to meet Chico Mendes, I met one of these rubber tappers, an old man then, of course, about 70, who had never managed to get back to his home state, and was finally, I think the Red Cross or somebody had given him his ticket money, and he was finally able to go back to his home state after being in Acre since the war. As I said, I went to meet, in fact, Chico Mendes, who is another person who gave his life in the name of saving the rainforests. And he was murdered in 1988. He was the leader of the rubber tappers. He organized what were called then, I've forgotten what they were called now, but anyway, groups of people, I mean, men, women, and children.
Empates.
Exactly, but to stand in the way of the loggers as they came to cut down their trees or knock down their trees. They used chains strung between tractors to bring down the trees. So the people would go to a particular area where they knew that the farmers wanted to log, and they would stand in the way and stop them logging it down. But I remember very clearly how amazed we were when we traveled around the state of Acre, how amazed we were by all the smoke. And at the time, the newspapers published reports saying that the weather in the Amazon was very bad. There were all these big clouds, planes couldn't land. But in fact, it was the smoke from forest fires. Only nobody recognized it then. And even when we went, I was traveling with another journalist, Sue Bramford, when we got a bus to go from the capital of Acre, Rio Branco, to Brasileia to meet Chico Mendes, who lived more or less in hiding at that time because he was being threatened all the time. And we drove through clouds of smoke. It was quite amazing. And we met Chico Mendes in Brasileia, so he could talk about his work. He was already being recognized on the world stage. He was invited to Washington because he denounced the funding made by the International Monetary Fund for farmers. We met him, I remember I interviewed him in a little square in the middle of the town, and he had his small daughter on his lap. But I always remember that he never really looked at me. He was always looking from side to side. And then I realized after a while that he was always expecting someone to come up and shoot him. And of course, a year or so later, they did. They shot him outside the back door of his own house and murdered him. And that has been a fate, of course, of many Amazon defenders, right up to Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips today. But so many people have in fact been killed when they tried to defend the rainforest, tried to defend the people who lived in the rainforest, tried to speak out about environmental destruction. And it's interesting to think that over the year, I mean, I've been writing about the Amazon, as Ali said, for a rather long time, all through the dictatorship and afterwards. And I remember, because I've been looking at a lot of my old stories recently. In fact, I put a selection of them into a book and published it here. But even in those days, and we're talking about sort of 74, 75, there were invasions of Indian lands, indigenous lands. The military plan for the Amazon was to build roads to make it more accessible, to bring people to colonize it, but also to encourage large cattle farms. And cattle farms not just run by traditional farmers, but by banks or other big institutions, because they gave them incredibly generous tax incentives to do that. So these huge farms, one of them was, for example, Volkswagen would just buy up vast tracts of land at almost the price, minimal prices. And these large holdings also would very often use slave labor to clear the land. And that is a practice that happened all through, ever since that time. And even today, slave labor, enforced labor, debt bondage, whatever you like to call it, is still found in many places in the Amazon, because for the land grabbers, for farmers who move in, it's the cheapest way of clearing the land. But anyway, over the years that I've been covering the Amazon, in an incredible number of projects and plans and programs have been introduced to deal with the Amazon, as it were, because from the point of view of the central government, I think the Amazon has always been seen as just as a sort of backyard full of resources. So it has to be exploited. Or it's also been seen as a region that you have to get through to go to ports. So over the years, there have been projects for building new lands, new roads, new highways, turning rivers into waterways for big ships, big cargo ships to go through, and also railways. There's a very efficient railway was built from the Carajás to take out all the mineral ore to the port in Maranhão. And there's a project now to build a railway called Ferro Norte in the south of the state of Pará, which again would be used to take out resources, driving through indigenous land again.
Sorry, John, can I just interrupt you one quick moment? I'm just a bit wary of the time, because we were only supposed to go until 2, and that's 2 minutes away. So I mean, I'm happy to stay a bit longer, but I don't know how, if everyone else is okay to stay a bit longer, because we would still like to.
Yeah, we've no rush to finish.
No,
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But what I could do is move on to today and what's happening today. And
Yeah.
obviously previous speakers like Ali and Rebecca have talked about the Bolsonaro years, what terrible years they were when law enforcement was practically abandoned, environmental agencies were dismantled, and Bolsonaro literally encouraged mining in indigenous land and invasion of land grabbers by receiving leaders of these groups in the Planalto Palace. And mining has already had a terrible effect on the Yanomami Indians, as it did in '89. I remember covering that when 15% of the population died. Now the miners are there again, but they're no longer just individual gold panners. Now they're mining companies using big machinery. But we do, after the victory of Lula, there is hope. I understand Rebecca's reservation, she's quite right, but I think that Lula, it seems to me, has embraced the cause of climate change, the climate emergency. The fact that he's going to Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, the COP27 next week, as he was invited personally by the Egyptian president. And this will show, I think, very clearly that Bolsonaro has already been sidelined. Nobody's going to bother to talk to the official Brazilian representatives there. They'll all be wanting to talk to Lula and to know about his plans for the future. And Norway, for example, has already promised to start the Amazon Fund again. But of course, we know it isn't just up to Lula. It's also up to the Brazilian Congress, which is a very conservative Congress. It's packed with people who defend mining interests, farming interests, who defend basically exploiting the Amazon. So, but on the other hand, the Congress is also has this large group of deputies who want to be with the government, whatever the hue of the government, left or right or whatever, they want to be in the government for personal advantage, of course, but also for the perks they get. So I think a lot of bargaining is going to go on. Lula will, I think, choose. He has at his disposal such fantastic people, people like Marina Silva, people like Isabella Teixeira, all sorts of very competent and informed people who know all about the Amazon, who've been working on it for years. Tasso Azevedo of Mapionas. There's a whole variety of Brazilians who are incredibly well informed, have a lot of experience in the Amazon. He has these people at his disposal if he wants to invite them. And he, of course, is already inviting many of them. The problem will be in Congress. But I think it's not just up to Brazil as well. Brazil obviously has a huge role to play in the next few years in terms of the environment. But also foreign markets have an important role to play. I mean, while there's still a demand for Brazilian beef, for Brazilian timber, for Brazilian soy, those things play a part too. While that demand continues, people will want to go on producing it. So I think under Lula, there is a chance of saving the rainforest, which certainly wouldn't have existed if Bolsonaro had been re-elected. That would have been goodbye to the forest. Under Lula, there's a chance. It's not going to be easy because there are maybe 27 million people who live in the Amazon region and who do need, after all, to earn money, to have jobs, to survive, and so on. Although it's always been one of the lies of the Bolsonaro administration is to say that his projects provide jobs and money for people who live there. That's untrue. I mean, studies show that the areas which have the greatest levels of deforestation also have the poorest levels of human development. So it's a big challenge to Lula, to Brazilians, to the world. And I think Lula now needs all the support he can get from every other country. Financially, yes, but also political support for his government, which will come under huge attack from within Brazil, from people trying to sabotage it, from people spreading fake news and so on. All that will go on. But you know, I'm hopeful. I think this is a chance. And Brazilians are hopeful that this will make a change. Thank you.
Thanks. And we have to be hopeful. There's no other way. And you know, scientists have been saying that the Amazon is close to a tipping point, and you know, its role of sequestering carbon has now, you know, been reversed, and parts of the Amazon are now emitting more carbon than they are actually removing from the atmosphere. So, you know, that we still have 2 months of, well, a month and a bit of Bolsonaro's government. We know that there's Congress men who are going to try and advance these anti-environment, anti-indigenous bills in Congress while Bolsonaro is still there. So the resistance will have to continue, but all this movement in the opposite direction already is a very positive, and you know, it's just the difference in our approach. I mean, the people that Bolsonaro put in these key posts in, you know, protection agencies, that all the people, all his ministers that had absolutely no knowledge or no experience of the area that they were put in charge of. And Lula is the opposite. He's choosing technical, experienced people in each of the areas, and in the environment, obviously, is going to be no difference. And like Jean said, you know, there's a whole, you know, range of people that he can go in to form his government and his administration. I think, you know, there's so much else. This could be a conversation for hours, but I think I'd like to open a bit for questions. If anyone has any questions, and then depending on people's availability, maybe we can continue.
Yes, well, thank you very much, all three of you. That was absolutely fascinating. So has anybody got a comment or a question that they'd like to put?
Maybe not.
Well, I'd like to ask something. So where has Bolsonaro been since the election? Has he been seen in public?
Well, it took almost 48 hours for him to make first appearance. His speech, he didn't concede.
No.
So he made like a 2-minute speech, just thanking the people who voted for him. He hasn't, you know, he's been having a very reduced agenda. I don't know, you know, what he's kind of more or less, he's just fallen into the background. He was hoping that all the people, his supporters, who were trying to question the election results, and that, you know, depending on the size of these protests, of these movements, there might be a justification, excuse for him to call on the armed forces to reestablish order in the country. So I think he was kind of waiting a bit for this, and then, you know, when it became obvious that that was not going to happen, then he finally came out to make the very, you know, poor.
Yeah.
And he's now he says he's going to refuse to pass on, sorry, what do you call the faixa? The faixa presidencial, what do you call it? The presidential
ribbon.
It's a sash.
All right. Oh, yeah.
So he's you know, he's
such a coward. He's such a coward.
Yeah.
He's behaving like the coward he is. And I think it's also, my impression is that, you know, he made all these threats of coups and insurrections, but In fact, he's trying to negotiate a sort of a deal that would protect him and his sons from going to prison, because they face real risk as long as they don't have, they're not covered by immunity any longer, as they don't hold office, you know. So I think, you know, that they raise their voices kind of like, we have the power if we want, but it's not quite. So now, I don't know, I'm enjoying to see him lose, you know, and not even being able to stand up for himself. And he's such a coward. And
he's a loser. So
yeah.
there was two of his sons are reported to have gone to the Italian embassy to seek Italian citizenship.
Oh,
maybe
right.
they're hoping to escape
Yeah.
Italy. I guess as Anat.
Yeah, Annette and Roger have got a hand up, and then Charles had one up. So I'll come back to you, Charles, next.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, it was related to the pandemic. We did hear what an awfully high mortality rate there was in Brazil. But we heard particularly about big cities like Sao Paulo in particular. But Jan mentioned the population of the Amazon being something like 27 million. I just wondered how bad the people of the Amazon region fared in the pandemic. Do you know about that?
Yeah. Hello, Roger. Thanks for the question. Yes, you're right to ask, because in fact, what happened was that indigenous groups were largely left to their own devices. There was a much higher death rate among indigenous peoples, including many of the old people. And this, for indigenous people, was a terrible loss, because the older people were seen as their memories. They had the knowledge. They were seen as the libraries, if you like, of the Amazon. Many of these people died from the lack of care. Also in the capital of the Amazon, the state of Amazonas, Manaus, in January, I think it was, there was a terrible crisis of lack of oxygen. People were dying they got people to hospital, but then they were dying on the floor. Their own relatives had to set out in desperate searches looking for oxygen tubes, because the federal government just took so long to supply them. And in fact, the first oxygen tubes to reach Manaus came from neighboring Venezuela country, which is attacked very frequently by Bolsonaro, but they sent lorry loads carrying oxygen tubes to Manaus, and they were the first ones to get there before supplies reached Manaus from other parts of Brazil. So the Amazon population, I think, fared very badly during the pandemic.
Oh, thank you. Charles, did you have a question?
Yes, I thanks very much for the talk. Obviously, we can, from over here in the UK, we can read, we can educate ourselves. What are the most practical things we can do to actually help? Are the projects we can invest in? Are the charities and organizations we can give money to? Are the things we should buy or not buy? What's the most helpful thing we can all do from over here?
Okay, so at Brazil Matters, we support some campaigns, and we support different campaigns from the indigenous peoples in Brazil, and also we try and replicate and do joint campaigns with the groups campaigning here, to highlight the companies here to contribute to Amazon deforestation. So there's lots of supermarkets here, for example, that buy meat or soy from illegally deforested areas in the Amazon. So there's some campaigns along those lines. Gold, a lot of the gold illegally mined in Brazil comes to the UK. So first of all, it's kind of tracing, the products that you're consuming and making sure that they are not coming from illegally deforested areas. That's one thing, one way in which you can contribute. Supporting the work that we, Brazil Matters, do here in the UK. Follow us on social media. and try and, you know, support those campaigns. There's gonna be London Mining Network is doing a campaign against BHP, which is Anglo-Australian mining company who was responsible with Vale, the Brazilian mining giant, for the largest environmental tragedy in Brazilian history, Mariana, which was completed 7 years on Saturday, the 5th of November, and that no one has been punished to this date. BHP now will have to answer in British courts because of campaigns by this group of lawyers, because before they were trying to keep it so they would only be tried in Brazilian courts and be much easier to evade justice. So this was a big victory that was announced a couple of months ago, and BHP is now, they've got their AGM meeting, but this year they're not going to hold it in the UK because for fear of protests, so they are only going to do it in Australia. So there's a campaign, why BHP, why are you hiding? So we're going to be posting some stuff about that. That's not Amazon, but it's environmentally related. So yeah, we're going to have different campaigns. We transport campaigns there. Brazil Matters is a very small collective. We're all volunteers. So our capacity is, you know, varies on how much we can do, but we will hope to be always publishing, posting about different campaigns that you can support in the Amazon.
But perhaps any of you could just post any links in the chat, if you like, that will remind us of what to look, of places to go and to get more information.
Yeah,
I'm going to post all our Brazil Matters social media here.
Thanks very much.
Elizabeth's got a hand up.
To ask more specific information.
Yeah, I'm thoroughly enjoying the conversation, and I very much value your individual comments in the presentation. But it has always occurred to me that for people in the UK, Brazil is the Amazon and Brazil is jungle and tall trees. We know that there's a lot of the Amazon outside Brazil. Do you have any comment to make about similar activity for preservation of the tropical forest and equivalent Cerrado areas, say in Colombia and in Peru and Ecuador?
Well, we know that there is a movement now, even from Lula, with the governors of these other states, to actually do a joint action to preserve the Amazon. This is one of the things that has come up since Lula's election, this new initiative of doing a local Amazonian initiative to protect the Amazon. But I'm not sure I answered your question there, because Brazil Matters, we deal mostly with Brazil, but we connect with groups from other countries as well, but we are focused solely on Brazil. So I don't know if Rebecca.
And I would say, Elizabeth, that there are like many organizations working in the whole Amazon basin. So that includes indigenous groups from Ecuador, from Peru. Amazon Watch is one of the NGOs that does a lot of work in Ecuador and Colombia, to say the least. And there is also local groups from Peru and Bolivia. And it's harder in the north, like in Suriname and the Guianas. There is less organized civil society as far as I know, but there's still like networks of indigenous peoples from that part of the Amazon, the eastern part, the western part. So I can share with Ali some of these links later, because I don't have them at hand, and then can pass them over to you.
Yeah.
But just to add something, because there's a lot of Brazil outside the Amazon as well, although we cannot disconnect, the country's fate to the Amazon, and the Amazon occupies more than half of our territory. Most of the people live on the coast and in the big cities, and that's where, it's concentrated most of like structural and, police violence and mass incarceration is happening. So all the other human rights struggles that we have in Brazil, that's also connected to the economic model that we have here. So I think, one of answering the question, the previous question about what you can do to help, I think it's also to talk about Brazil as a whole and, beyond the Amazon, and why we as a country being home to the Amazon still struggle with so much poverty and famine and, like basic rights not assured to the majority of the population. And that goes right back to the question on why we are destroying the Amazon and how who is benefited by the current model of exploration, so please talk about Brazil as a whole and get to know about our other problems, the Black youth genocide that happens here. We are one of the countries where more Black youth dies by violent deaths like murderers and police violence and traffic accidents. So I think there's the whole context also helps to understand why the Amazon goes on like the way it goes on. So just as a reminder, and actually I need to leave because I mixed up the time zones and I had to move around another commitment that I had. Yes, in the middle of the holidays and the time zones, I'm kind of like, I'm sorry, but it was really nice to talk to you. Thanks again for the opportunity.
It was lovely to have you with us. It's been great.
Please, I'm accessible. Ali has all my contact information, so we keep in touch. Thanks for your support and to a new time for the Amazon.
We'll give you a round of applause virtually.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Ali.
Ali, can I just add to the reply to Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Under Bolsonaro never wanted much to do with the other South American countries or Latin American countries. He didn't believe in multilateral organizations. So he never took part in these, in any sort of meeting with other countries, only when he practically had to. But there is an Amazonian pact of the countries in the Amazon. I think it's 8 or 9 countries. And under Lula, who does believe in multilateral organizations, I'm absolutely sure that these regional collections of countries or organizations of countries will once again become an important factor in trying to organize multilateral actions in the Amazon. Because of course, in countries like Ecuador and Colombia, there's massive oil drilling. Indigenous groups try to stop it, but it's very difficult for them. Every country is slightly different, has slightly different problems, but they have a lot of things in common, which is trying to protect the Amazon rainforest from all these destructive activities. And I think, again, under Lula, there's a real chance that cross-border participation or organization, collaboration rather, will once again be important, be activated.
Yeah, Fiona.
Just to add to that, and I've seen that, there's also, what is it, an OPEC of the rainforest or something, where he's linking with, where Brazil's going to be linking with Democratic Republic of Congo and Indonesia to look at forests around the world.
Yes, that's a global thing, isn't it? That's an international thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I posted on the chat John's last article about
saw that.
A regular contributor to Lab. She has a blog that she's constantly publishing articles about the political situation in Brazil and the environment. So I want to have a look at that and follow that as well.
Thanks, Alice.
And Annette, you're muted at the moment. Unmute yourself, Annette.
Annette, you.
I was just interested in your surname, Rocha.
Rocha is from
my surname comes from being married to Brazilian.
All right, our surname.
Yours, between you. As I know the Rocha.
It's actually, I think it's a Portuguese surname, isn't it?
Originally, yeah, originally.
Yeah.
But it's a fairly common surname in Brazil. There are lots of Rochas all over the place. Some of them are good people and some of them are terrible people.
Yeah, I'll bear that in mind.
I hope we're on the good side.
Lovely. Well, I think we can bring that to a close now. It's been a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all very much indeed.
Yeah.
I'm certainly learning more about Brazil and the Amazon in the last few weeks, and it's wonderful. And we've got lots of extra reading and things to look at, documentaries and so on. So it's been a very rich and varied journey for us all here in England. So Ali and Jan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add to thank the continuing. I'd just like to add to thank Jan and Dave and the Continuing Learning Group for hosting us for these 5 days, for these 5 weeks. Yeah, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So next week.
One more thing.
Yeah.
Oh.
To ask, people who are more interested in supporting us as well to follow us on social media, to contact us and keep an eye on future actions.
Yeah, definitely.
And also what you can do, because there's another thing that has been kind of come to light recently, not so recently, is about pension funds, lots of pension funds who are actually to Amazon deforestation. So that's another issue. I mean, we want to publish more information about this in the coming months. It's more like from next year.
Oh my God, yeah.
So need some, funding to carry on doing the work that we do. But if you're interested in knowing any more specifics, feel free to contact us. I've left our email there as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. So one thing that you can do, if there's 3 little dots just at the bottom of the chat, if you click on the 3 little dots, it says save chat, and you can save all the links in the chat. I'll be sending round these to everybody that's booked, that actually came through my booking link, which is not everyone. Next week, we've got Dr. Cecilia Gontijo-Leal, who talking about the importance of Amazonian streams for the future of the largest river basin on Earth. The following week is Camila Silva on how bad is the recent wildfire crisis in the Amazon forest. And the final one is Professor Jos Barlow, policy options for a flourishing Amazon. And I think he's going to the COP, and he's going to be bringing back stories from the COP. And those 3 are all from the Lancaster Environment Centre. And on the 19th and 20th of November, in person and online, we've got an absolutely fascinating Saturday afternoon and Sunday full day. We've got 5 speakers, including Juliana, who's here somewhere, who did our interpreting last week, and she's going to be speaking next week at our conference. We've got 4 other speakers from Lancaster Environment Centre and local Lancaster activists, most of them from the Amazon, living in Lancaster. We've got a very rich city in Lancaster, full of Brazilians and South Americans on the Saturday. And on the Sunday, we have Nelly Marubo, who spoke last week, doing a keynote speech about the importance of the forest for the Marubo people. We've got a speaker from Greenpeace, a speaker from Cool Earth, and a speaker from Survival International talking about their work. Well, Survival International and Cool Earth are talking about their work with contacted tribes and uncontacted tribes. And Greenpeace is doing what Charles talked about, getting us to think about what we can do, what we can change in our lives, what we need to be campaigning on locally. And then in the afternoon, we've got a roundtable with 2 of Dom Phillips's colleagues from The Guardian, Tom Phillips and Jonathan Watts, who will be online from Brazil, talking with Alison, who will be in person in Lancaster, about how things have changed since the murders for reporting on the Amazon. And I was shocked by what Rebecca said, that there used to be a line that wasn't crossed and now there is. It makes me realise that things have really changed. So we've got all of this going on. We've also got, if you're in Lancaster itself, we've got art and photography and an exhibition, lots of things. This has been a really important part of it. Thank you so much, Ali and Jan. Rebecca.
Thanks, everyone.